Perfect. Thank you. So yeah, welcome to my talk, how to transform your training offering with data, research, and insight. And the first thing I want to start with is a quick definition on those last three terms, data, research, and insight, because I think we all have access to lots of data, and we've heard a lot this afternoon about the role that data has in our businesses. Data really is just kind of that raw, unfiltered, numerical words, anything that we have access to that we can learn from. But generally, it's in an unstructured format. Research is the process of taking our data. You might have seen this image going around on LinkedIn recently of the Lego analogy, taking those unstructured bricks and organizing it into something recognizable. And then insight is what we build with it. It's the outcome of the research process. I've got a very brief slide just to introduce myself and FlexMR. We are a market research and insight agency. We've been around for over 20 years. Started out as a full service agency, doing things like on-street intercepts back when those were a thing, as well as telephone research. And slowly over the years, we've innovated and moved online to now provide market research services along with a technology platform. And we work with a whole range of customers across the world, from FMCG and CPG, all the way through to utility, financial services, training and education, a real broad mix. So this is just a very long-winded way of saying we've been around a while, and hopefully we've got some useful insight to share on this topic. I think it's a good place to start by looking at the landscape that we all operate in. And for any business, this is pretty much the same. I think we've all felt over the last couple of years that increasing pressure. There's some absolutely wild statistics out there about just the volume of competition that exists in nearly any marketplace today. 30,000 products and services launched in 2020 in the UK alone. On top of that, we've got consumer habits that are changing. And we heard about this a little bit in that first presentation today, that shift to more hybrid delivery models, or as the last year has forced, completely online delivery models. 75% of consumers tried a new shopping habit in 2020. We're also facing other pressures internally as well. So the number one challenge for business leaders is creating business impact, tying the day-to-day operations to real differences in growth, in performance, in the operation of a business. And then finally, 44% of marketing leaders, this is from statistics gathered in 2021, 44% of leaders still expect marketing budgets to shrink, which when your data, your research, your insight is taken from those budgets, creates this real pressure to do more with less. And the tension this leads to, although it's existed for much longer, is this dichotomy of having too much data and not enough action. Sometimes we call it analysis paralysis, having so much data that you just don't know what to do with it, that you don't know where to start. And I think the terminology in the industry, in a lot of industries, somewhat muddies this water as well. I'm sure we've all heard of CXR, customer experience research, NPS, Net Promoter Score, customer feedback initiatives, more recently, customer effort scores. Just understanding where to start, what's going to be important, and what data we need to make effective decisions can be quite difficult. So I like to break it down into 5 questions that anybody can ask to turn that unstructured data, those qualitative and quantitative words and numbers into useful insight that helps us make decisions. And the first question is really simple. What is most important for my business to know? And this can be a range of things. I think we've heard a strong case for, in a lot of teams, an important consideration is customer experience. What is the customer experience? How good is the customer experience? For others, it might be around revenue growth. For a different group, it might be around delivery and how we interface with customers at the point of delivery. But once we've decided what is important to know, the next question is, how can I find out or measure my business against that? And measurement's an important point because this is going to direct what kind of research, what kind of data we're going to need. If we take NPS, Net Promoter Score, as an example, it wasn't a huge surprise, but it's really fascinating that recommendation is so high up there on the list of what drives business success and new growth for training firms, because recommendation is measured by Net Promoter Score. And I've got a few slides on this later about why this particular method of data capture is so useful. But in terms of what we need to know, if we're looking at how do we get more recommendations, Net Promoter Score is the measurement we want to use. So question one, what do we want to know? Question two, how can I measure or find that out? Then, and I think this one is skipped quite a lot, what data do I have already that can contribute to the answer? As we heard from things like CRM systems, there's a huge amount of data locked up in businesses already. We have huge, vast quantities of customer data, interactions, even individual trainers getting their feedback and their experience delivering courses or building materials. We can access both the employee side and the customer side of data, but auditing and figuring out what we already have access to is an important step, because that leads us on to asking what else we need in order to create a complete, robust answer. And then finally, our fifth question is quite simply, what actions am I willing to take based on the findings? Depending on how radical and how different the results turn out compared to your expectations, it might require radical action. And it's a fair point to ask at the outset of any research project, am I willing to take that action? If we're not willing to take the action, it's not worth investing in the research in the first place. And with that, I want to introduce 4 key terms in terms of data and research. You might be familiar with some of these already, so I'll just give pretty brief overview definitions. Qual and quant are our 2 main data types. They're often described as 2 sides of the same coin. Qual is anything about words, things that are difficult to measure, thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Quant, on the other side, is anything related to numbers and statistics, things that we can put a tangible measure on. We might describe quant as the what of a question, to look at what effect is happening that can be measured, and qual is the why behind it. What behaviors, what attitudes, what emotions are driving that effect? And then we've also got the distinction between exploratory and explanatory research. As they sound, these are pretty different. So exploratory research is when we don't know necessarily what we're looking for, we want to go to the market and find out something new. That might be a new course offering. What can we add to our product line, our course line? Or what is it that our regular customer base or employees want from us? If we don't know the answer to that question, we're going out and exploring what the answer might be. And then contrasting that, we have explanatory research, which is much more about explaining the effects of something that's happened. So we observe something, That might be a dip in NPS. It might be a blip on our customer satisfaction tracking. And we want to know why that's happened. We want an explanation of the effect. On my next couple slides, what I'd like to introduce are 3 fairly standard, fairly easy types of research that you can conduct to affect different parts of your training offering. The first, hopefully everyone will have heard of, is focus groups and interviews. And this is really best for that exploratory stage of the research process. So we might look to focus groups and interviews for things like developing a new course, figuring out a new product or service, or getting a really in-depth look at a particular segment of our market. There's a couple of key considerations when we're running focus groups. And focus groups are, as they sound, getting a bunch of people together. Pre-COVID, this would often be in a physical room. Post-COVID, we're seeing much more the rise of online tools. Even Zoom is quite an easy way to run a focus group. Usually no more than about 6 people, because we want to give everybody enough time to speak, express their opinion, and get to know each other. And we're going to ask them directed questions on a particular topic. So when we go into that focus group, it's important to have an outline, what we often call a topic guide, of questions and answers that we want to find out. So it might be that example of developing a new product, service, or course, in which case we'd go through our topic guide of questions like, what is it about our current offering that you like? What's missing? Why is that missing? What would it mean to you in order to have access to that particular type of training? Can you think of any arguments against why we might offer that? And by the end of the session, what we should have is a pretty robust and in-depth answer to the question of what we want to develop. But in order to get there, there's a few things we're going to need. The first is controlled stimuli. So stimuli is just the word for resources that we're going to use throughout the focus group or throughout the interview. It might be things like images. If you've got some training materials already and you're already in that development stage, you might want to consider sharing a few of these and getting specific feedback on the direction. It might also be things like promotional videos. Any image, video, audio clip, written document, anything that you want to share, make sure it's included and given consideration within that topic guide. We also need to ask the right questions, and we're going to split questions into 2 groups during a focus group. There's group questions where we want to get everybody's opinions. We want to stimulate debate, discussion, and draw out the differences between people. And there's individual questions. Sometimes there might be one opinion that it's worth pulling on a thread for, understanding a unique point of view in more detail. And balancing these two is the real skill of getting the most out of this type of research, because we want that in-depth look at a topic, but we also want that balanced group view. But just to add one final complication, what we don't want to happen is what's called groupthink. This is an effect where the more dominant members in a focus group might start to outweigh the less dominant members, and slowly the less dominant members shift their opinions in order to think with the group. There's a difference between having a similar opinion and having groupthink. And it's important to be aware that this is a possibility and understand some of the ways that we might be able to counter this effect, but also recognize that in some cases, opinions are just similar because we're talking to a relatively similar group of people. And then finally, something that we often recommend in focus group scenarios is adding something called a show of hands, a quick poll. There's been some really great examples throughout the last couple talks where asking a live question, getting those quantitative responses, and then using that can fuel further discussion. And if you're running to a kind of a dry point within there, that can be a really helpful tool. I want to shift slightly to compare focus groups with interviews. Interviews are another research method, but instead of having a group, we're looking at one individual. The real reason that a lot of people favor interviews is that groupthink and group bias have been a long-running issue with focus groups. Interviews typically remove this kind of bias and put a complete focus on understanding one opinion in depth. But if we want to achieve the same scale that we might through a focus group, we're going to need to run multiple interviews. We're going to need to talk to 5 or 6 people, and that's going to extend the length of our research process. So although it might be considered the purest form of research by some, it's often associated with high costs and lengthy timescales. But there is a case that online tools, online software is making interviewing much more efficient. Oh, and finally, one last point is we can bring stakeholders, we can bring other decision makers into these rooms as well. We can put them in what are called virtual or physical observation rooms, where people can watch customer feedback unfold in front of them. And if you've got decision makers who are kind of one step removed from the point of delivery, if they don't interact with customers that often, this could be a really powerful tool for making the case for change. It's important not to underestimate the impact that interviews and focus groups can have as a political tool in driving change as well. If there is a strong case that needs to be made for changing culture, changing a product, changing an experience, then watching it straight from a customer is a really powerful way of achieving that. The next thing we're going to talk about are diaries and ethnographies. Whereas focus groups and interviews are usually a singular point in time in which we will go through a research project and come to a conclusion, diaries and ethnographies tend to take on a more longitudinal nature. They tend to run for a much longer period. So we might consider using a diary or an ethnographic study for gathering course feedback, especially if we're running a course over 1, 2, or more months. We want to see the points in that quite lengthy journey, which are highlights, what's a low light, what are the experiences, the emotions that people go through at various points, and what are the opportunities to improve. A quick overview on the differences. So diaries are simple repeating tasks, usually completed at regular intervals, usually completed at regular intervals, sorry. They're usually completed at the end of a module, perhaps on a weekly basis, perhaps at a particular point of interaction. And we can include both numerical, quant metrics, and qualitative descriptions that highlight the reasoning behind the feedback. One of the most powerful points for diaries is that they can include both the what and the why. We can look at an overview of the statistical measures collected across multiple people, and then we can dig into the written feedback and understand what's driving that particular emotion, that particular piece of feedback at a moment in time. Ethnographies are similar, but also quite distinct. Ethnography involves observing how people interact with a course over a period of time. So instead of asking people to record their own thoughts and feelings, we're observing them and we're making those notes instead. There's a pretty popular, relatively cheap, relatively easy form of research that a lot of startups and a lot of small teams will use called the self-ethnography. One of the first things a lot of marketers are taught is at the moment you step to the other side, the moment you start to sell something, you're not the customer anymore. And that's a really humbling and quite often difficult distinction to make. That when I go to my local coffee shop, I am a customer, but when I sit at my work desk and I think about my customers, even if I am the target market, even if I'm selling something that in another scenario I would buy, just by virtue of my position, I am no longer the customer. Our view is ever so slightly changed. So self-ethnography is changing that around. It's stepping to the other side again. It is testing our own courses, our own learning materials on ourselves. In factories, this is called walking the floor quite often. And it's the experience of going through something as a customer, detailing and being quite honest about your own experiences and using that to formulate some actions to address problems. A couple of best practices to consider for diary studies. First of all, think about where, when, and why you want people to make diary entries, and also the practical considerations of this. It's possible to do on paper. It's also possible to use online tools for journaling. But how often are you going to ask people to feedback? Why are you asking them to feedback? And what are you going to do with that data in regards to that specific point in time? Ask both those qualitative and quantitative questions because we want to know what and why. And also on top of that, include space for directed and free-form feedback. Some of the most important customer feedback is free-form. It's non-directed, and it's not time-bound either. It might be later on that day when a customer remembers something that you taught them and they want to express that it's been useful to them. Or it just might not be at a point that you've considered in the journey before. It's also useful to emphasize the aspects of anonymity and privacy to make sure that people are comfortable sharing honest and open opinions. And then what we want to do is using that anonymity, detaching our analysis from individuals, look for the themes that emerge, use a time-bound analysis to identify where themes split out and at what points in time experience them most similar. The last example I'm going to talk about are surveys. And this is really for quantitative measurable data, often used quite effectively post-course as net promoter scores. I know there's another talk coming up on surveys, so I don't want to dwell on this too much, but a couple quick points to make. First of all, don't worry about the type of surveys. There is a huge list of different surveys used for a really wide variety of purposes, and there's no real standard definition of where and when a survey can be used. The important point is it's matched to a need that you have. And one really useful need is the net promoter score. Returning to that point I made earlier, if it's important for us as a business to generate referrals, then the net promoter score is what's going to tell us if we're going to generate those referrals and if we're going to increase the amount of referrals next year, or if we need to take more action to generate more. The NPS setup is really simple, and this is really where its power lies. It's just two questions. One is the what, one is the why. On a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend this course, this product to a friend? Or it doesn't have to be a friend, it can be to a colleague, to a co-worker, to anybody else. And then explain what influenced your score. There's quite an academic debate happening at the moment about the value of NPS and whether or not there are more effective measures of the likelihood to promote. But at a basic level, it's a simple question that generates a lot of responses that will get us the data we need. And a lot of the alternatives that have been proposed over the years don't quite capture the simplicity and the elegance of the NPS score. But that said, a word of warning, although the color codes on my slide here do relate to how you should consider whether or not someone will refer you, a 9 or a 10 being a likely referral, a 7 or 8 being neutral, and all the way from 1 to 6 generally being considered negative. It's important that people are not influenced to give higher scores. There was a time I went to a relatively popular hotel chain recently, and I was asked by the receptionist to fill out the NPS, which is fine. And then the comment that was made at the end was along the lines of, oh, and if you give us a 9 or a 10, then we get a little bonus as well. That moves NPS from a useful feedback tool into a review score. Net Promoter Score is not a review. It's for you to use the feedback to track over time what your referrals are going to be like and what's really driving them. As soon as it moves into a review system, you're losing most of the value that you can get from this. Lastly, I just want to touch on how to bring it all together, how to use research, data, and insight to drive change within your business. And the first point to make here is it's important to see the research process in full. Often we look at the stage which is considered collection, analysis, and reporting. But there's actually a few stages within there, and there's different roles within there too. And it might be the case that you as an individual, if you work in a small team, take on all 3 roles of the delegate, the person who is running the research, the researcher who analyzes and ensures quality control, and the decision maker who is going to use the insight to make a decision. But it's still important to understand that those 3 roles are distinct, regardless of how many people they involve. And the real point of this diagram is to emphasize that last stage, that research doesn't end at reporting. We have to distribute it too. If we want to make the right changes, if we want to improve customer satisfaction, improve our referrals, we need to get it out to the right people at the right time. And it's important to consider what we would call a data flow in this sense. And this brings together all of the different data sources that you have access to. Passive data like customer analytics, what's held in your CRM, sales data, the experiences of your trainers and your frontline staff, as well as active data, things we have specifically gone out to collect to plug the holes in our knowledge, market research. And we're going to bring them all together into a central analysis, because it's important not just to look at each topic in isolation, but to look at how the different data types build the picture of the project we're looking at, and then to distribute that to the right teams as well. That last slide we looked at, research doesn't end at reporting. We need to make sure it gets to the marketing team, the sales team, the operations team, everybody who is going to be involved in delivering the change that we're looking to see. And part of this involves selecting the right reporting method. This is a slide that I like to bring up just to highlight that research reporting and engaging decision makers in your data can be done in a really wide variety of ways. We typically often fall back on written reports or slide decks and presentations, but there's a really broad range of increasingly creative and experimental ways we can get people to engage with us. Infographics, dashboards, explainer videos, providing people access to data to interact with and explore themselves. We can bring in things like storytelling techniques, immersion sessions. There's a really great example of some work we did with a financial services firm where we got some of their senior leadership teams, some of their board members, and sat them in front of customers, and not only played out the research element, but got those customers to ask questions to the leadership team. And it really brought to life the challenges that their customers have. And it had a lasting, memorable impact on them. And then as we move up into increasingly experimental ideas, we've seen success recently with things like video, treating research reporting like an internal advertising campaign, all the way up to things like art and installation and engaging people in reception areas with the data that we've collected. And by considering the full range of reporting methods at our disposal, we're really able to align the right method to the right person, to the right type of engagement, and hopefully better connect with the people who are going to enact the change that we need. If you'd like to find out more information on anything we've talked about, there are plenty of online guides available. Some of the ones I often recommend: Qualtrics, SurveyMonkey, Smart Insights, and I'd be remiss not to mention our own resources and blogs at FlexMR. There's a huge pool of information already out there. But also trial things, have an experimental mindset, and make use of the data you already have. And then one final resource I'd like to give a particular mention to is if you scan this QR code here, we have what we've called a market research playbook. It has about 40 projects included within its pages, which you can use to do everything from understand brand awareness to running employee engagement surveys, all the way through to measuring marketing effectiveness, building a brand position, measuring course and service experience over time. There's also a web link to it there if you'd like to find out more. I think that brings me to the end, so we should have about 15 minutes remaining for any questions.
Well, thank you very much for that, Chris. Really appreciate it. Some really interesting points there. We've actually had a question through on the Q&A regarding the NPS, and what are your views on using the NPS to tackle issues with detractors, or I suppose the issues that detractors raise?
Yeah, NPS is a really good way to, I guess, intercept detractors before it has more of a tangible impact on your marketing. I think that NPS is a really helpful mechanism. A lot of the time, people will leave, say, online reviews or be more vocal about particularly positive and particularly negative experiences that they have. NPS gives people an outlet to express their concerns, to talk about the challenges they had in a more private forum first. And I think it is worth, depending on the volume of detractors you have, trying to address each detractor individually. We're not necessarily looking like we would with reviews to compensate people for having a bad experience, but it is important to take the time to address, to make people feel like their concerns are being listened to, and that you are going to consider their opinions going forward.
Interesting. And then another question we had was more related to the training offering. How long should a typical training company spend going through course feedback?
That's a good question. I think it really depends on the size of your offering, the variety of what you have to offer the market. But in general, it's going to depend on the issues and the problems you want to solve. If you've noticed a decline in sales, then that warrants a fairly substantive investigation, potentially. If it isn't fairly obvious at the surface level, the effects driving that. If things are going well, it's tempting to spend less time on research, and absolutely, if there are less issues to address, I think that's fair as well. In general, I think it's worth having something in your calendar monthly to review feedback. Feedback can be kind of a black hole where you can sink a lot of time if you want to. So just managing that effectively, making sure you have something periodically, and I think that's probably more important than the amount of time, having the time periodically to return to it.
And what would you do with overwhelmingly positive or negative feedback? What would be your typical call to actions from there?
And it's always great to have overwhelmingly positive feedback. But I think if that is the case, it's still worth digging into the drivers behind it. What is it that you're doing differently to others that is causing that? And the same with overwhelmingly negative feedback. You know, we're all human, and overwhelmingly negative feedback can be difficult to handle. But considered from a more objective standpoint, there's useful data in there. And I think that's, for both sides of the coin, the important thing to remember, that whether positive or negative, there is useful data and things that you can take out of the results. But it's about asking those 5 questions and starting with, what does my business need to know? What can this feedback tell me about that?
And you mentioned earlier about running research if there's things like sales going down and having those research. Is it expensive to run lots of research like that at the same time?
We do typically find that there is an expectation that research, a bit like some of the previous presenters have said, that it's one of these terms which is associated with bigger companies, that you need a whole research and insight department in order to get effective feedback. But really just talking to the people who have been through your training, customer experience, making use of those passive data sources is another way of managing it as well. So make use of what you already have. And then if you have a limited budget, there is a great amount of DIY tools and online softwares that can help with that now as well.
So, and then we've had a final question come through as well from saying, I worry about our delegates being honest about the tutor performance as the tutor will be grading their exams. I actually have students ask if they can complete the feedback after they know their grade. This continues to be a challenge for us. Is there any advice you can give anyone who's concerned about how the feedback can affect kind of operational activities day to day?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a fairly common challenge whenever you've got that relationship of, in a lot of situations, there's that dynamic of feedback being used as leverage almost, or the opposite, being worried that feedback will impact service delivery. I think the important thing is to try and provide as much separation as possible. And that can be done in simple ways. It can be done by, we talk a lot about humanizing research in a lot of situations. We talk a lot about making it seem like it comes from a real person and emphasizing the one-to-one connection. If you're running a survey, however, and there is that element, that dynamic in play, you might want to go the other way and dehumanize it, make it seem like more like an automated process. Remove the person collecting the feedback from the person doing the grading, provide as much of a buffer between those two operational roles as possible.
Excellent. Well, some great advice there, Chris. Really appreciate your time and sharing your insights into how to collect, analyze, and use course data to transform your offering. Some really, really good takeaways there, and some great feedback as well from all our participants. So, yeah, a massive thank you for taking time out of your day to come and speak at EVEREST 2021.